the more ultra processed foods you eat, and there was no nuance in this one. So like
Yeah.
in cardiovascular disease and diabetes, type 2 diabetes, there was some nuance where like some ultra processed foods seem to be less bad. But with the depression one, that was like, nah, like they're all. So the more you eat, the more likely you are to be depressed, to have depression.
Right.
The more likely, and it's like, and if you're a child or a teen or an adolescent, it's even worse.
Yeah.
Like, and that's probably, I think probably because we know that if you're diagnosed with a mental health condition before you're 24, like 75% of mental health diagnoses are first made before that age.
Yeah.
So we know that a majority of adults who have mental health issues actually were first diagnosed as adolescents or children.
Right.
And so then we look at, okay, this is all pointing in the same direction, and we have a mental health crisis on our hands. Is that surprising if we know that this is the food that especially children and young people are eating most of?
Right.
So there's lots of studies looking at percentage of energy intake attributable to ultra-processed foods. Everyone agrees that it's above 50%. But when we look at different age groups, it's like in toddlers, so like 2-year-olds, and in adolescents, it's like up to 72%.
Yeah.
Wow.
So let's get into the weeds with it a little bit
Yeah.
in terms of like the kinds of foods that we eat and the kinds of ingredients that
Yeah.
might be harmful to our microbiome and maybe even some of the additives in the food.
Yeah.
So let's just start with the big one, ultra-processed food.
Right. Yeah. So ultra-processed foods, there's lots of, unfortunately, like the science is there in terms of epidemiological evidence. But there hasn't been that many trials, like randomized control trials, like Kevin Hall famously did his. But there's so much resistance from the food industry.
Yeah.
Really? Is that the reason that
I mean,
there's no
yeah.
trials going on?
No. I think the reason there isn't trials going on is because it's not being funded. I think it will be now. There's lots of recommendations for more funding for ultra-processed food research. But I think that it's a bit, smoking is a good comparison. There was so much epidemiological data. It was like, we think smoking is doing this thing.
Yeah.
We think smoking, and everyone's like, nah. Like the cigarette industry were like, no, like why? Like we're not sure. It could be something else, right? It's not the smoking. It's not the actual cigarettes.
Yeah.
Something else. And this is what's happening. It's what we're seeing with ultra-processed foods. It's like, but it's not the actual processing. We think, is it just because they're high in fat and salt and sugar? Like,
Yeah.
and you know, there's been work done to show how many like high fat, salt, sugar foods are also ultra-processed foods. And like a lot of them are, but not all of them. And so classic example is like diet soda.
Right.
It's not high fat, salt or sugar. It is an ultra-processed food.
Right.
It's definitely not good for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they're like, well, but we don't know if it's the processing. So anyway, we're in this phase now where the epidemiological evidence is so strong that I think it would be, and I have some, I'm very unpopular with a lot of people for saying this, by the way. Like it would be very short-sighted to say that ultra-processed foods are not having a negative health impact. They clearly are. So we can look at it by seeing how they've become so commonplace in the food environment. You can look, and the epidemiological data we have is like the more of it you eat, the worse your health outcomes associated, like the worse association you have. So, so it's all pointing in the same direction. There is some nuance, which is where I think recognizing that the NOVA classification was created for research. Amazing classification, works very well in research, but it's not really designed for consumer use. Like it's hard for someone to navigate NOVA 4 classification to make their shopping easier. So that's where more consumer focused tool, and this is something we're working on at Zoe, to actually help people know, like, okay, of the NOVA 4 foods, so of the ultra processed foods, should I be as worried about granary bread from the supermarket as I am about the Twinkies?
Yeah. And just to explain what the NOVA classification is.
Yeah,
Can you
so,
go ahead and do that?
Yeah, of course. The NOVA classification is this like way of grouping foods according to how processed they are.
Okay.
So starting from like the whole food. So this is like your corn on the cob, the actual corn on the cob. And then you move up to the corn on the cob has been like taken off the cob and tinned. And that's a processed food. And that's not a problem for health. Like that's not an issue. Then there's a different group for cooking oils and condiments like salt and pepper. Like they don't seem to have a health impact. They're not negative. And like in their processing, of course, too much salt is not great. And then the Nova 4, like Nova 4 is this ultra processed food category. So if we take the corn example, so you've gone from like corn on the cob, corn in a tin, and then Doritos, which are corn tortilla chips, but like, where's the corn? And it's no shade on like the brand, by the way. It's just, it's been ultra processed to be a crunchy triangle with colors and flavors, and
they taste so good.
It tastes so good. Like I like the Cool
that?
Ranch. What is it? Cool, the Cool one.
Ranch,
Yeah,
they're good. So certainly there's that impact of it's addictive because it's so tasty.
Yeah.
And it's not filling, so we need to eat more.
Right.
And maybe that's why it's made the way it's made, is so that you pay more because you're having to eat more.
Right. So,
but more on. I'm more interested personally on a more microbiome level or a cellular level as to what is exactly going on here.
And that's where the industry is like, we don't have the evidence to say exactly which mechanisms have like been affected.
Mm-hmm.
So exactly what you just said, we know that they're hyperpalatable. And listen, it's not a mistake that they're hyperpalatable.
Mm-hmm.
The food industry spends tons of money on researching, like, is that Cocoa Pop tastier or is that Cocoa Pop? And they do user research and see which one gets eaten more of.
Mm-hmm.
So which one do people eat more of, which means they'll finish a pack earlier, which means they'll buy more.
Mm-hmm.
And they do satiety. Like, it's a science. It's food science.
Yeah.
So they are formulated in that way. But when we look at their health effects, so Kevin Hall study is like the best we have for understanding how much more people eat when they're given this food, and then what happens to their like biometrics basically, and blood tests. But when we think about the gut microbiome, so when you're eating, let's use corn. I like it. So when you're eating the corn, if you're having corn on the cob or like the tinned corn or even popcorn, right, which is high in fiber actually, so great. You eat the food and you're getting fiber, you're getting polyphenols. It's actually quite hard. So the texture means that you're gonna chew and swallow, and it's gonna take some time to empty from your stomach into your small intestine. And actually when it gets to the small intestine, because the fiber is so hard, you're only going to extract a fraction of the sugars and basically the nutrients, because it's the food matrix impacts, which is like the structure of the food, impacts how much you're able to absorb, right? Yeah. And then the fiber gets to your gut microbiome in the large intestine, and there they have a party. They're like, yeah, especially corn, like so fibrous. So they're breaking the fibers down. And this is like going back to like, how does this impact the brain? When the fibers are broken down, the microbes that break that like corn fiber, because microbes like different things, they're very picky. They will only eat the thing they like. So you have your like corn loving microbes. They're breaking the fiber down and they're making byproducts, microbiome, microbe poop. Yeah. They're called postbiotics, right? And you can buy them as supplements now. But essentially, those postbiotics then have an effect, not only on the actual gut cells, so the lining of our gut is one cell thick, it's super fragile, not only on that, but also they result in signaling molecules that go up the vagus nerve to the brain directly and go into the bloodstream and impact the brain indirectly. Now, if these are short-chain fatty acids, they actually help to feed the cells in the gut to make sure they're creating enough mucin, which is like the snot layer of your gut. It's so sexy, this whole topic. But it protects your gut barrier. Like your gut barrier is one cell thick. Yeah. And right on the other side of it is a ton of immune system cells waiting for information. So the mucin layer is super important. It needs to be thick. It needs to be hard to cross. Because if you start getting like waste products from basically your gut leaking into like the outside, where the immune system's like, what is this? Get inflammation. Inflammation is a normal response to something that's not supposed to be there. And when there's inflammation, of course, it changes the whole ecosystem. And the more inflammation you have, it like self-propagates if it doesn't repair. And we know this from like really extreme cases of severe malnutrition in children. It's actually where a lot of this science has come from, because when you look at which children survive and which don't, often the children that have the most damage to the gut are the ones that don't survive, because the immune system is so dependent on the gut. So you've had this corn, this has all happened, magical. You're also quite satiated, but actually it's a high volume, low calorie density food, because you haven't been able to absorb that much energy from it. So you've eaten this and you've got just what you need from it. Your microbiome is happy. And you're also going to go to the loo like more efficiently because you have enough fiber, your microbiome is working, the mucin is there, it's all moving along nicely. And in that poo, you're getting rid of like quite a lot of microbes, but you're also getting rid of all the like the hormones you don't need anymore. You're getting rid of any kind of the toxins that come from the liver, from cellular processes across the body. They're all being excreted. And it seems obvious, but it's worth saying that if you're constipated, you're not going to loo regularly, those things aren't being excreted. And they actually can get back in, because especially if you have an inflamed gut, like it's permeable. So the things that you're trying to get rid of are coming back in, right? So that's with the corn or your sweet corn.
So would you recommend not holding it in?
100%, yeah. Go to the loo.
I've heard her say that before, so I just wanted her to say that.
What, not hold in your poo?
Yeah, not hold in your poo, or not hold in your farts or something like that.
Oh, right, yeah. Right? I mean, that's also, like, there was an influencer recently, a carnivore diet influencer, who was like, I haven't farted in 3 years. And I was like, oh, my Lord. That is not a good sign. So, yeah, please, yeah. Of course, like, flatulence can be problematic if you have bowel conditions, but there's a normal level of flatulence which is like human, and everyone needs to just like get on board with it. Now let's eat a Dorito now. Okay, Cool Ranch. Tastes great. I've eaten like half a pack because it's so easy. Okay, I'm not full, by the way. I've eaten half a pack, but I'm not full because there's like no food matrix. The minute I chew it, it's basically a smush. Most of it is absorbed like in my small intestine. All the sugars are absorbed. All the fats that are not a healthy fat profile are absorbed. And actually the colors and the flavorings and the emulsifiers that make them taste weirdly creamy when you eat them, they've made their way down to the gut microbiome, but there's no fiber has made its way down. So the gut microbes are like, oh, okay, we've got some like leftover bad fats, maybe something like a little bit of the smush that wasn't absorbed at the small intestine level. And then we have these new xenobiotics. We've got these chemicals that we did not evolve with. And the gut microbiome is like, what's that? Can I break it down? And so the science on this is fairly new, but the trials that have been done on like, it's essentially feeding people high emulsifier diets, clearly show that there's an increased inflammation in the gut. So much so that now the recommendations for people with irritable bowel diseases like Crohn's is to reduce ultra-processed foods because emulsifiers make it worse.
And when you say inflammation in the gut, you mean that process of, that mucin not being intact.
Yeah.
Those
gaps.
foreign bodies getting into the into the circulation.
And specifically into the immune system tissues that are just outside with loads of the immune system. The estimate is about 80% plus of the immune system is lying just outside the gut. And that's because it's one of our biggest surfaces that come into contact with external things. It makes sense, right? So you have the immune system cells like congregate where there's a chance of break-in. And the gut is a huge one for this. So it's talking about that. It's like the inflammation that results from things that shouldn't be crossing. But it's also really uncomfortable. It's like, it's not that you have the inflammation and you don't notice, you have gut symptoms. And it's not just gut symptoms, of course. So if we look at the association between having Crohn's disease or irritable bowel syndrome and mental health, your mental health is much more likely to be worse when you have these inflammatory bowel conditions. So, and that just goes to show like the gut-brain axis is incredibly powerful. Now, I'm sure you guys know Professor John Crean. He's like he's the king of the gut-brain axis. And he's done amazing science that shows how the like postbiotics themselves and microbes travel to the brain and have an impact on mental health, have an impact on brain health, can actually impact the way that brain diseases maybe start or continue. So like Parkinson's has been really well researched for this. There's now some noise about Alzheimer's plaques, and are they actually an immune reaction to bacteria that have found their way? So there's that science is fascinating.
So that's what I was gonna ask. Is our gut microbiome crossing the blood-brain barrier?
Well, it depends which side of the fence you're on for the argument of like the blood-brain barrier being so impenetrable. I mean, from what I've seen, I think that we're moving away from the blood-brain barrier being like the Berlin Wall and you can't cross it. It's not that straightforward. things do cross. And okay, so let's say that bacteria might be crossing, maybe, but certainly inflammatory cytokines are. They're small enough.
Yeah.
So if you have like a high inflammation status in your gut, the inflammatory cytokines are crossing.
Yeah.
And we see like a really beautiful way of thinking about this is with rheumatoid arthritis, right? Like one of the drugs that is most effective for rheumatoid arthritis is an antidepressant. It like reduce. So is it because it's an anti-inflammatory that is then reducing depression, and is that what's happening? So there's lots of ways that when inflammatory status is high, then you're much more likely to be depressed. Yeah. And when that's brought down, you reverse that mental health condition. So it's really interesting. Yeah. And we can do this like with diet, right? So if you then feed your microbes like less of the Doritos, more of the corn, you're helping your gut microbiome to maintain a healthy ecosystem in your gut. It's reducing the likelihood or the severity of inflammation in your gut. And that has a direct impact on your brain and your mental health. And mental health for me is like not so dichotomous. It's not brain health that's different. Like mental health is more. But it all works together. Yeah. So what's really clear is like the ultra-processed food research. I mean, one of the biggest reviews was looking at consumption of ultra-processed foods and depression, and it made a huge splash in like the news, and everyone was like, oh my God, because it showed how the more ultra-processed foods you eat, and there was no nuance in this one. So in cardiovascular disease and diabetes, type 2 diabetes, there was some nuance where like some ultra-processed foods seemed to be less bad. But with the depression one, that was like, nah, like they're all. So the more you eat, the more likely you are to be depressed, to have depression. Right. The more likely, and it's like, and if you're a child or a teen or an adolescent, it's even worse. Yeah. Like, and that's probably because we know that if you're diagnosed with a mental health condition before you're 24, like 75% of mental health diagnoses are first made before that age. Yeah. So we know that a majority of adults who have mental health issues actually were first diagnosed as adolescents or children. Right. And so then we look at, okay, this is all pointing in the same direction, and we have a mental health crisis on our hands. Is that surprising if we know that this is the food that especially children and young people are eating most of? Yeah. So there's lots of studies looking at percentage of energy intake attributable to ultra-processed foods. Everyone agrees that it's above 50%. But when we look at different age groups, it's like in toddlers, so like 2-year-olds, and in adolescents, it's like up to 72%. Yeah. Wow. That's 72% wild. Of your energy intake is coming from these foods. Yeah. And I'm all for finding the nuance. I'm all for finding ways to help people actually eat more baked beans because they're ultra-processed foods, but they're beans, so we think they're probably good. Like, if that's your ultra-processed food, great. But whilst we can see this trend, wouldn't it just be better to say, like, we just need to reduce that percentage? I don't care how you do it. But, like, when we look to countries that have a lower percentage intake, so Italy, Romania, they're, like, below 15%. They're, like, 10%, 12% of their calorie intake is ultra-processed foods.
So what are the toddlers and adolescents eating?
Well, the food environment is completely different. So they don't have when you go to a supermarket or a store here or in the UK, it's like shelves and shelves of only ultra-processed foods. There's 70% of food manufacturing companies make only ultra-processed foods, like no healthy food, right. Like zero. Yeah.